The celebration team has chosen an overall theme for Lent. It's called Flirting with God. It created some controversy on the celebration team. The controversy surrounded the term flirting, not God. Well, historically, that probably should create more controversy than flirting. But flirting has some rather uncomfortable and sometimes rancid connotations, particularly for the female gender. But we decided to go with it nonetheless because flirting is an uncomfortable word. And it probably is what most of us embrace in regard to the way we live, the commitments we make, the way we practice our faith, and a lot of other lists. I looked at a lot of other lists in terms of how we flirt. I looked up flirting in the dictionary, and that pretty well set it as a theme in terms of my preparation for Lent. Here are the definitions of flirt. Behaving as though you are attracted to someone or something without any serious intent. And the second definition of flirt is to show superficial interest in something or someone without committing oneself. Commitment has become a four-letter word of our culture these days. When I ask people if they want to join the church, which means making a commitment to the church, they often say, I have decided not to commit myself to anything. And I know the reason for that, I think, from my own experience. The reason we're resistant or hesitant to commit ourselves to anything is because so often what we commit ourselves to betrays us. What they become is not what we wanted them to become. And that's the case with almost every movement, including spiritual movements or religious movements. So commitment to a religious organization becomes particularly questionable if you don't like the way the religious organization is going. And when it comes to Christianity, we tend to lump all of Christianity into one big box and say, I don't like the way it's going. So we flirt with it. I'd like to be here, but I don't really want to get involved. I like what you do, but I'm not sure I want to jump in and get both feet wet. And that will be the theme for Lent. The next Sunday's commentary, which will be given by Frank Williams. I have the privilege of celebrating the 125th anniversary of the church in Yuma by being a guest speaker at the church that I used to serve, which is quite an honor here at First Church Yuma. But the choir sang a song that relates to commitment. It started with the words, we're coming to the edge. And we are. We know we're coming to the edge of something. And it's frightening. And at the same time, it's exciting because what has been before hasn't worked very well. So we're coming to the edge. And a lot of us are ready to jump. And the problem with jumping is it's a commitment. And the other problem with jumping is that you can't flirt with jumping. So we're coming to the edge, running on the water. Water is a symbol of spirit. And that's the way I'm going to interpret your song. Coming to the edge, running on the water, walking on the water, coming through the fog. God, haven't we been in a fog? Your sons and daughters, let the river run. Let the river run. Let all the dreamers wake the nations. And I hope, in terms of Lent, that you will recognize that we are the dreamers. Just as surely as Jesus was a dreamer, as all the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures were dreamers, as Martin Luther King was a dreamer, I have a dream that one day, that's the dream. That's the dream that Jesus had. And the dream that he had was the dream that the Hebrews had of a new Jerusalem. The whole theme of Lent comes from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scripture story of release from bondage, wandering in the wilderness, and inheriting the promised land. It's a metaphor of where we go. We start in bondage. We start trapped in a system. It's probably illusion. We start trapped in a system that imprisons us in terms of what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to believe, and how we're supposed to behave. And I know there's something in me that says there has to be more. There must be more than this. And that's the pull that I would invite us all, especially myself, to respond to during this Lenten series. The New Jerusalem is a story that I told to the children at Yuma 37 years ago during Lent. And they came forward just as our children came forward, and I told them a story about a little boy who was age 12. You'll know the story. Little boy, age 12, that came to a big city with his parents and his relatives, and they experienced a major festival in that big city. And they experienced the festival, and he experienced his own commissioning, so to speak. And then the family and the parents, the family and the relatives started back to their hometown. And on the way back to their hometown, they realized that their son was missing. They thought he was with the relatives, but he wasn't. So they were quite disturbed, and they hurried back. They hurried back to the big city, and they found their son in the temple, or in the church. Now you already know who I mean. And the mother came up. No, no Holy Virgin Mary here now. The mother comes up and says, she was a peasant. She probably, let's not even suggest that she was profanity. But she said to this young man whose name was Jesus, just who do you think you are? Don't you know you're violating the rules of our family? Don't you know that this is not the way we celebrate this festival? You don't go off on your own half-cock and don't tell your parents where you're going. Sound familiar? And you think I'm angry. Wait till your father is. That's sort of the way I told the story. And I hadn't given the boy's name yet. So I said to these kids, and do you know what that boy's name was? And one little voice said, Mud. Well, interestingly enough, and this is the problem with taking this journey, his name became Mud. In fact, whenever you try to go against the status quo, or the way things are supposed to be, your name pretty well becomes Mud. Of course, his name was Jesus, but before I go any further, I need to acquaint you with the situation that occurred in his lifetime, what was going on at that particular time in Palestine. In order to absorb the incredible commitment that this boy made, what was happening at that time was that it was sort of a military it was a military occupied territory which was intimately and actively concerned with national security. They wanted, you may think I'm just trying to make this sound like today, but this was actually the conditions. The borders, they wanted the borders secure. They wanted their military along the borders, and if possible, they would extend the borders for their own economic gain. Or they would extend their influence for their own economic gain. These military occupational forces existed because of the taxes that this imperial government placed upon the shoulders of the citizens, let's call it Palestine, of the citizens of Palestine. this is true. The economic burden of the taxes that this imperial power rested upon, mainly, were the peasants. The beneficiaries of these taxes was the military, the religious authorities, and the political authorities. You could do a proper exegesis of the history, which in seminary we call the Sitzenleben of these times. That's pretty accurate. That was the top 1 or 2%. Beginning to sound familiar? That was the top 1 or 2%. The bottom 98 to 99% were in abject poverty, and that wasn't the end of it. That wasn't the end of it. There was an additional tax called the temple tax, which the temple initiated to all of those who had to participate in the religious practices of the time. It was the temple authorities that benefited from that tax, as well as the occupational forces. The poor did not benefit at all. As a matter of fact, the poor became poorer. That's the situation that Jesus came into at age 12. Then he said something profoundly revolutionary. And you may think I'm getting political here. I'm not. I'm not getting political. This was the situation at that time. And apparently, this boy said to his mother, this Jesus said to his mother, when she said, "Why are you doing this to us?" It was a good Jewish mother response. How can you do this after all I've done for you? I probably shouldn't even say that. And I'm sorry. And Jesus said, "Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business? Did you not know that I must be about God's business?" Now, I'm not going to allow you to think that this is some pious religious comment that Jesus made because he was the only begotten Son of God. This was a struggle for him. It was probably, what was being celebrated in Jerusalem was probably his bar mitzvah as well, because he was 12 years old, which means from that time on, this is what bar mitzvah does, from that time on, he had to take ethical and moral responsibility for all the decisions he made. That's what the bar mitzvah does. In other words, he was becoming an adult. So let's assume it was his bar mitzvah, and his mother says, "Why did you do this to us?" And his ethical moral decision was this: did you not know that I must be about God's business? Now think of the political, religious, social, military implications of the statement that he just made. What he was saying was heresy. He was saying, in terms of what was expected of him, he was saying Caesar is not the one whose will I will do. My institutionalized religion is not the will that I will follow. The socio-economic regulations and rules that we have had placed upon our society is not what will govern my behavior. What will govern my behavior is God and God alone. Did you not know that I must be about God's business? You catch the absolutely revolutionary aspect of what Jesus is saying? In order for us to get from bondage to the promised land, or from the wilderness to the New Jerusalem, what we learn from what what's called the good news is that it's good news, but it's not easy news. And that means I will be directed in my life by that force that created the cosmos 15 billion years ago. I will be guided by the same force that governs the harmony and the chaos, by the way, that's part of it. The harmony and chaos of all creation. That's the force that I'm going to be governed by. I'm going to be governed and directed by the power through which I live and move and have my being. I'm going to be directed by the image of God and the Word that is made flesh in me. And the reason that Jesus is so important to my life is that he apparently did it. He did it. It didn't end up so well for him. At the very end of his life, his name was Mud. At least according to the Roman authorities, the military authorities, the religious authorities, the political authorities, and the economic authorities. They all blasted him. They crucified him, as a matter of fact. Now, I'm not suggesting that the same fate awaits us if we confront the illusory nature of what we've been clinging to. By illusory, I mean it's ephemeral. It passes away. It's not permanent. But if we choose to select this illusory, mystical, spiritual power through which we live and move and have our being, it often, not always, but it often, predictably, will go against Caesar. And that's the journey we're on. And what the story in the Bible tells me is that I can't make it from Egypt to the New Jerusalem without being guided by this force. I love my country because I grew up here and have taken it for granted. I guess I haven't completely absorbed the greatness of this nation and the inspiration of being completely free. When you talk to John Acquire from Sudan, you begin to realize how lucky we are. Susan and my mother-in-law and I sat down to a rather meager meal the other day. It was kind of makeshift. We call it fending. And we said our prayer, and I realized that probably 3/4 of the earth had nothing like we had in that rather meager meal. So I love my country, and I dream of a time, you know this, and you dream it as well, of peace on earth and goodwill toward all human beings, toward all creation. I long for that time. That's the driving force in my life. That's the dream I have. But I also know that we're a nation based, like Palestine 2,000 years ago, on national security. We're very concerned about our borders, and we justify what we do. We justify. This is naming it, by the way, and a lot of you won't like this. But we justify our moving beyond our borders because of national security or because of the economic benefit it will have for us or for the security it will provide for us. It's hard to hear, isn't it? That's my country. So we have been in perpetual war since my birth, but long before that, because of what's now called national security. And of course, within the system that we embrace, we can justify our actions. We can do that. It makes perfect sense if we embrace a particular system that's based on security. But God says in an indirect way through the great teacher, the only security is through God. The only security is through that power through which you live and move and have your being. The only way we have of addressing this perpetual war mechanism that we're participating in is by acknowledging that a lot of our boys and girls, men and women, a lot of our men and women are dead because of war. So are a lot of their men and women. A lot of men and women are crippled, and so are theirs because of war. But there's more than that. Our economy is crippled because of that. Many people are homeless because of that. Many people suffer because they're in the 99% that experiencing economic disparity because of the, I don't need to create more divisiveness here, but most of us here are in that 99 percentile. And then there's another strange phenomenon that's happening in our country these days that happened in Palestine 2,000 years ago, and that is there's kind of a wedding, kind of an enmeshment of religion, politics, and military. If you ever read Arnold Toynbee, you'll find that the decline of civilizations are a result of the enmeshment of those three phenomena. That means that our religion is somehow associated with our patriotism and our economic well-being. The more patriotic we are, the richer we are, the better Christians we are. That may not make sense to you, but that's a message we get indirectly. And Jesus comes along and says, I come to present regime change. I will render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. But if what God asks of me comes in conflict with what Caesar asks of me, I will do what God wants of me. Now that's dangerous to even say, because selfish interests come in there. But if selfish interests stand in the way of oneness, or stand in the way of empathy, or stand in the way of harmony, it's the wrong direction. I can't tell you what the right direction is. I can only tell you what the right direction is for my life, just as assuredly as Jesus could only tell you what the right direction was for his life, and Martin Luther King could tell you what the right direction was for his life. I wish I had the courage of those guys. But the Lenten journey is about courage. And I need to let you know that I'm not preaching at you. I'm preaching at me. And if the shoe fits, wear it. What I'm trying to communicate is that saying yes to a Lenten journey is not easy. It takes a great amount of courage. And as an introduction today, what I hope to do in the next 7 weeks, starting with Frank next week, is to go through the life of Jesus of Nazareth and show you the challenges that he faced in regard to the regime change that he initiated. And by regime change, I meant going from Caesar to God. And by the way, you can still be of Caesar. You can still live within the definition of what your country and your faith and your economy ask of you, and not be of them. Next week's commentary done by Frank will be testing the waters. And quite often for me, that's about as far as I get. Too cold, too hot, too rough, too fast, too much current. testing the waters. The week after that will be the temptations in the wilderness. And that was no easy time for Jesus. We often think, well, Jesus was the Son of God. He was perfect in every way. So, piece of cake. You know, when the devil comes to confront him. But what happens if the devil, dangerous territory, what happens if the devil comes in the form of economics? What happens if the devil comes in the form of power? Or what happens if it comes in the form of keeping what I have, come what may? Those were the temptations that he had. And you might recall, much like he said at age 12, he said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." That's hard. "Get thee behind me, Satan." It's a very polite, biblical way of saying, go to hell. And he says, "I will seek God and God alone." That's the focus of Lent. To seek God and God alone. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all else will be added unto you. The interesting thing about Christianity is we say it, but we've never tried it. Let's say we've seldom tried it. And we're not going to get to the New Jerusalem this Lent. But we're going to start. And we're going to begin to realize that this can actually make an impact on the way I live. The way I live and move and have my being. So, let the river run. The Spirit run. We're coming to the edge. Running on the water. Coming through the fog. Let the river run. Let all the dreamers wake the nations. Come the New Jerusalem that it talks about. The last chapters of Revelation. Let's journey together. It could be very, very exciting.